Good afternoon to those of you in North America. A very good afternoon, and in fact, a late afternoon for those of you in Europe. Thanks for tuning in. And good morning to folks in Australia, Japan. I know there's a few people in India who are here. Welcome to this very special, our first event of the fall semester book club with Richard Thaler. My name is Dilip Soman. I serve as a director of an institute called BEAR, Behavioral Economics in Action at the Rotman School. And I'm also the project director of a large international initiative on behavioral insights called BI.org, Behaviorally Informed Organizations. It's a network of researchers and partners from all over the world. And while a lot of us have complained about the fact that we are still working from home and doing events online, the online world has given us a rare opportunity to connect with a lot of researchers from all over the world, as well as a lot of practitioners. Now, while we are doing this online, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the land on which I and the University of Toronto operates, and would encourage all of you to take a moment and think about the original inhabitants of the land. This land has traditionally, for thousands of years, been the land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, the University of Toronto sits on a land that is still the meeting place to many Indigenous people from all across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. I have great pleasure in welcoming today's guest, Richard Thaler. What's nice about welcoming and introducing Richard is that he needs no introduction. So I'm actually going to precisely do that. But I will note a couple of things. So obviously, Richard has written lots of papers and lots of books. The one book for which he's perhaps the most well-known is the 2008 book called Nudge. He wrote that with Cass Sunstein. The world has changed since Nudge was written. Right in the book, in the latest version of Nudge, Richard talks about the fact that that was the time when he first got his first iPhone, and I think it was Cass that had a BlackBerry. But if you think about it, it really was a different world. I mean, we had no Uber back then, and the gig economy did not exist in its form that it does today. I'm thinking back, I think Netflix was still shipping DVDs, and I think they just started streaming around the time your book first came out. Nudge obviously has had an impact on all of us, so definitely all of us here in today's event. And it's had an impact in many ways. It's made behavioral science popular. It's made it applicable. There are now over 200, 250 different nudge units, if you will, all across the world. And we could talk a lot about how things have changed. But given that the world has changed so much, and I guess also prompted by the fact that we had COVID and people had time to reflect on what had happened, Richard and Cass have now written this book. It's called Nudge, the Final Edition, and we're going to talk about that book today. And the way we're going to do it is in a slightly different format. It's going to be a book club in the sense that we've received a lot of questions. We've actually invited a few people to ask their questions in person on this live stream. There are several other questions that I have that I'm going to collate and try and integrate and ask Richard as we go through. Richard has asked that there should be no questions on cricket, which obviously has narrowed down the set considerably. And today on Twitter, he also requested no difficult questions, but that hasn't changed a whole lot because all the questions are easy. So like I say, I'll read out some questions. I'll invite a few other people to ask their questions. And other than that, if people have questions that you still want to submit, you can do that by going to slido.com, slido.com, and entering the event code Thaler, Thaler, and enter your question there. Richard, welcome back to Rotman. Not once, not twice, but this would have been a three-peat if we had you in person. But it's always an honor and pleasure to have you back.
It's good to be back. If cyber via cyber, but it's always good to be back.
Fantastic. Thank you so very much. I'm going to jump straight into it. And I guess the first thing I did when I got my my book was I looked at the cover. And there's two things on the cover. So before we jump into the serious stuff, I'm just curious about whether there's a story here. The first thing that I noticed was that there's a third elephant. And I don't know if that has any serious, deep, significant meaning. But then I also looked at the back and I saw, obviously, some of the usual suspects talking about the book. There's Adam Grant and Bob Cialdini and Danny Kahneman inside. But you've got a talking head. You've got David Byrne. What's the story either there or with the elephants, Richard?
Well, the third elephant was actually my idea. The elephants have become part of nudge lore. And so I wanted to keep them, but I wanted to signal that the book was really new, not just some reprinting. Mm-hmm. And so it was my thought to add another elephant. As for David, David Byrne is a fan of behavioral science and quite serious about it. And he has collaborated with a friend of mine. They produced an interactive behavioral science show. And so he very kindly agreed to read the book. And, some people, when you ask them to write a blurb, they respond suspiciously quickly. And David was asking for more time because he had 2 chapters left to read. So he's serious.
That's great. I was actually thinking about the elephants too. I think one of the conversations that have happened, I think, since 2008 was, yeah, we've got to nudge people, but we also have to nudge the nudgers. And so I thought maybe there was a deeper philosophical meaning with the big elephant being the meta nudgers and then the nudgers, but I hear you.
See in it what you will.
Excellent. I'm going to bring on our first guest, Kerry Morvich, in just a minute. But looking back since 2008, there's obviously been a lot of aha moments. And I think, we spoke a little bit about that when you were here with your Misbehaving book 5 years ago. But there's also admittedly a lot of confusion, people asking for clarification. One of the things that's generated a lot of debate is organ donations. We'll get to that in just a couple of minutes. Changes, controversies, cultural challenges, COVID, I mean, lots of C's there. And it's lovely that you have a complaints department section in this book, because that was just like absolutely beautiful. Of course, I don't know if that's going to stop people from complaining about the complaints section. But Gas was called, I remember this was 2014. I think there was a radio show or talk show host called Glenn Beck, who I think called him the most dangerous man in America. You managed to escape that sort of critique.
Well, that's because I didn't have an important job. So I was not the most dangerous man in America, but I was friends with the most dangerous man in America. And, I could cause my own trouble.
There you go. One place of confusion to many has been sort of the more, what's the precise definition of a nudge? What is a nudge? What isn't a nudge? And I think there's been a fair bit of confusion also because a lot of people on social media platforms have tended to use the word nudge to refer to absolutely anything that changes behavior. So on the one hand, you've had people like Pelle Hansen who've kind of tried to put a lot of structure on defining what a nudge is. And then on the other hand, you've got people who are like, anything is a nudge, like there's a window behind me is a nudge, or the shape of my room is a nudge. Kerry has a question in a similar spirit. So Kerry, if you're on, if you could just unmute and ask your question and we can get us started.
Sure. Well, first, I wanted to thank Richard. I think I didn't realize when I first read the book in 2008 how useful it would be in explaining to people why so much of the decision sciences matter. And I think putting that in context was really something that was wonderful and did great things both for the study of the psychology and economics of judgment decision making, but also for its impact on the world. And in the applications, I think it's really interesting that there are many cases where what we would include in nudging often includes lots of things like user experience improvement or simplification processes of language. So if you're asking someone to become an organ donor, we can use a default option, but also simplify the form that they have to complete. And is this kind of simplification process included in what you would think of as a nudge, or is that something that's complementary to it? So going to Dilip's sort of initial thread is, let's say that we had a team of copy editors and they went through every government document and improved the language there so that citizens could understand what the documents contained. Would that be included in what you think of as a nudge, or what are sort of the boundaries of the category that you would define? How would you define that?
Yeah, so let me answer that the following way. Well, if I define a nudge precisely in a way that might even satisfy Pella, who's a philosopher, so that's a high hurdle. The way we define it is it's some feature of the environment that alters the behavior of humans, but not econs, and does so without requiring anyone to do anything. So according to that very narrow definition, incentives don't matter, but improved language could. But I don't think we should get hung up on the definition of a nudge. And that title, which was not one that we're responsible for, one of the many publishers who rejected the book suggested nudge might be a good title, is a mixed blessing. It did help sell books, but I think of the book as a book about choice architecture. And I think the real answer to your question is everything is about choice architecture. Mm-hmm. And so certainly improving the language, making things simpler, that's all improving the choice architecture. And one of the goals in this rewrite was to stress the choice architecture and move beyond the tweaks. So that what I worry about is that people think that nudging is just about tweaks, adding a word, subtracting a word, changing the color. No, it can be a complete restructuring of the choice environment, in the same sense in which going from a cafeteria to a menu changes the choice architecture of a restaurant.
So that's interesting. And I think it kind of leads to another question. Kevin is going to be on in just a minute, but before Kevin comes on, that has to do with how intricate the psychology behind nudging should be. So we've heard you say in many forums, it's as simple as making it easy and making it fun. And so in fact, there was one person that emailed, let me see if I can actually find the quote here. They said something along the following lines. They said, how much psychology do I truly need? On one hand, the mantra of making it easy sounds like a simple guiding light. On the other hand, when I read this book, there's an awful lot of intellectual academic stuff. I'm just quoting here in the book. Put differently, what are the skills and competencies I should look for when I'm hiring people into a nudge unit?
Well, I think the answer to that depends on what you want them to do. Mm-hmm. So much of what people in so-called nudge units do is do tests. Right. And that requires academic training. You should know how to run a field experiment, and you should know the relevant statistical methods to make sure that you have sufficient power. Mm-hmm. Now, it's a different question of what manipulations. What are the treatments going to be?
Correct.
And where do they come from? And some of them can come from pure common sense, making it easy. It's still my best trick.
That's right.
And it's the phrase I said most often when speaking to ministers in the UK. Now, that's not to say we haven't learned things from psychologists. We have, but you can get a long way with common sense.
Fair enough. Right. And I think that whole mantra of making it easy is simple, it's compelling. It can be translated into actual metrics, which obviously people in businesses like. So how many clicks does it take you to get from a landing page to the place where you can cancel your New York Times subscription? The answer is infinite, we know. But stuff like that, and I think that makes it a lot more concrete. On the notion of definition, again, I think one of the other controversies that had swirled up, and I guess the reason why Cass got called a dangerous person, was the allegation that nudging is manipulative. And I know Kevin has a question on, again, thinking about how do we think about the manipulation of the definition of manipulation and whether, in fact, nudging, as we just spoke about, means it. So, Kevin, if you're there, do you want to just jump in?
Sure. Thanks a lot, Dilip and Bear, and thank you, Richard, for being here. So, yes, thinking about manipulation, you define it in the book as not adequately respecting people's capacity for rational deliberation. It kind of made me think about that Chicago Road example you used early on in the book. To me, since it relies on an optical illusion, it may fall into that category of manipulation. Now, assuming your response to that is that, well, it is, but it's acceptable because of the publicity principle that you outlined there, and that the choice architect would have no problem defending this publicly because it's so obviously beneficial. I wonder about where the line is there, and how much we should be ready to defer to the choice architect, given that one glance at Twitter makes us see that people are willing to publicly defend some pretty morally nebulous positions.
Yeah, so unlike Pelle Hansen, I'm not a philosopher. And I don't claim to know what is right and wrong. I do know that it's impossible not to nudge, and in some ways, it's impossible not to manipulate. If you're having an election in Canada, the politicians are giving speeches that are intended to get people to vote for them. And whether you want to call that rhetoric or influencing or manipulation, probably depends on where you're coming from. I think the most successful framer, let's use that word, in recent years was Dominic Cummings in the UK, who basically destroyed the United Kingdom, in my opinion, with 6 words. The first 3 were take back control. And you can find a video of him explaining how that uses the concept of loss aversion. Now, whether withdrawing from the EU gives England more or less control is a debatable point, but it was a brilliant debating tactic. And then in the second election, get Brexit done. People were weary. I'm sure your various candidates are promising to get COVID done. Good luck with that. We would all like that. So in some ways, these arguments are arguments for philosophers. It's like pornography. We know it when we see it. And so I think I have for 13 years been signing copies of the book Nudge for Good. Dilip probably has one. And I will continue to do that, but good will be in the eyes of the beholder.
And the good and the bad is a nice segue into the new cousin of Nudge that's debuted in this book, Sludge, of course. Dale has a question on that. But the whole, I mean, the notion of sludge is pretty interesting. I mean, it's kind of like, I love the title sludge. I've used it a lot. I'm an engineer by training. It means something else to me, but it works perfectly well. The metaphor is great. But Dale, if you're on, do you want to jump in and ask your question about sludge?
Yes, thank you, Dilip. So, Richard, I think this is obviously one of the key concepts. It gets its own chapter. It is, you could say, deep and sticky as a concept. But what I really want to know is whether sludge is the inverse of nudge, or whether there's really something different about entrapping people through these principles.
Yeah. So again, I don't know whether we want to get too bogged down on definitions. I like, Cass and I had some discussions about what the most useful definition is. I like to use it as a pejorative term, and it needn't be defined that way. So we define it as unnecessary frictions, and we really want to limit it to unnecessary frictions that cause harm. Now, if you put sand on an icy road, that is applying, well, useful friction. And things like cooling off periods can also be useful. But I like to think of it as the evil cousin of nudge. And if you just put a minus sign in front of everything, you get sludge. It's not really as simple as that. That would be true if make it easy were the only trick in the choice architect's bag, and it isn't. But we thought it was a useful addition to the new book.
But it's interesting because I think this is kind of going back to the discussion on manipulation and now sludge. I think intent plays an important role, doesn't it? I mean, at the end of the day, there are the mechanics of the whole thing. Is there friction or not? Or have you changed the choice architecture to influence people? But then there's the intent. And so nudging for good is different from nudging for bad, is different from creating friction for good and creating friction for bad. So I do think it's important to think about the intent. And I think that's where a lot of the debates get. Yeah.
Netflix now starts the next episode.
Oh, yeah.
Without you doing anything. And we now you could say they're making it easy for you to watch the next show, or they're making it hard for you to stop. And I'm not going to get into that discussion.
Fair enough. The one discussion that might be useful to get into is the one on organ donation. Now, obviously, that discussion from Nudge 2008, the Eric Johnson paper, that the science paper from 2003, has been quoted, misquoted, understood, misunderstood. Lots of questions coming in about opt-in, opt-out versus prompted choice, or does the fact that Wales tried to change the default and didn't succeed mean that defaults don't work, or ethical issues with presumed consent? I guess at the heart of this, there's the fundamental difference between sort of your traditional default experiments and organ donation. There's two differences. One is it's a two-stage process. Stage one, you consent. And then stage two is the organ harvesting process. And then there are two decision makers. There's you as the donor and then your family, right? But instead of reading out all these questions, maybe I'll just leave it to you to respond to all of these critiques that have come up.
Okay, so the most frustrating thing after the publication of Nudge was people were convinced that we were advocates for presumed consent.
Correct.
Now, it's true that when we decided to write this book, we had seen Eric's graph.
Mm-hmm.
And we thought, oh, well, that's a chapter. We'll write that.
Mm-hmm.
And then we started reading the literature, and we ended up advocating something else that we call prompted choice, which is an opt-in with a nudge. Now, every time a country switched on Twitter, I would get congratulations. Hey, way to go, Thaler. You know, another country has done what you've wanted, and I would start tearing my hair out. So I took a very deep dive on this topic and that chapter is completely rewritten.
Mm-hmm.
Here's my take on it. The first is, if you look at Dan and Eric's famous graph, the fact that almost no one opts out should tell you something. And it probably should tell you that people aren't paying very much attention to it. And because we know defaults don't always work.
Mm-hmm.
There are lots of situations where people override the default. So how much weight should we as a society place on the fact that 98% of people did nothing? The people who keep watching the next episode on Netflix, is that because they prefer to watch that or are stuck in their couch?
Mm-hmm.
The second, the empirical question is, well, does it help? And that turns out to be a very difficult empirical question. It doesn't help. There aren't very many countries. It helps, I think, if you do the analysis, including US states as jurisdictions. And of course, many of them are larger than most countries. And if you do that, you come to the conclusion that an opt-in system, like we have in the US and Canada, gets 25% roughly more organs donated.
Mm-hmm.
Part of the problem in doing those analyses is people often misclassify Spain. Spain is the world's leader, and they're the world's leader because they have the best organ harvesting choice architecture.
Mm-hmm.
Very carefully thought of. As soon as a patient looks like they might be a potential donor, wheels start spinning. And it is true that Spain once passed a law adopting presumed consent, but a year later reversed it.
Mm-hmm.
And they're still classified in most analyses as being in the presumed consent. If you take them out, there's nothing there.
Right.
So I think morally and in terms of getting the most lives saved, my answer to the, Eric and Dan's paper is called "Do Defaults Save Lives?" And my answer is yes. And make the default, you have to opt in.
Right. And so it sounds like it's got to be a two-pronged strategy. There's obviously the opt-in versus opt-out, but then conversations with family, I don't think anyone has done anything at all to facilitate those conversations. And I think
Spain and in the US, it's very localized. Mm-hmm. Philadelphia and the Philadelphia area has a very efficient system kind of modeled on Spain. And look, the other thing about the US system, I'm not sure whether this is true in Canada, we have what's called first person consent. So if you have opted in as an organ donor, legally your wishes count.
Mm-hmm.
And so the organ donation people can go and say, your loved one chose to be an organ donor, and legally we're required to follow his or her wishes. Now, if the family makes a big stink, they can stop it, but that's a very powerful opening statement.
Mm-hmm.
And much more powerful than your loved one failed to fill out some form opting out, which doesn't really tell you anything.
Or even making it easy to put those wishes in the hospital or medical records. I don't think that's something that people have thought of, right? And today, with the technology that we have, it is a lot easier to do those things. But I guess it's not as simple as just changing opt-in to opt-out or the other way around. There's a whole bunch of specific micro decisions that we need to target.
And this goes back to what I was saying before. One of the things I tried to emphasize in this version of the book, the final version, is choice architecture.
Correct.
And what the defaults are. If you, to go back to Netflix, if you think about their choice architecture, there's lots of layers.
Right.
And whether a show restarts is just one. What things you see, what they choose to show you, all of that is part of a very successful bit of choice architecture.
Thomas Walsh has a question. I'm just going to preface it by saying, since 2008, obviously, like we said, many things changed. One of the things that changed was controversies in the social science. And obviously, we had the replication crisis and people beating drums about ethics and manipulation. Thomas, you want to jump in and talk about sort of your question about the death of behavioral economics? And I suspect the response we're going to hear, the word that I think you once told me you learned from Herb Simon, pleonasm. But Thomas, over to you.
Yeah. Thanks a lot there, Dilip, and thanks to Richard for the talk. I just wanted to ask what you think of people who say that the death of behavioral economics is imminent. I've seen some people say that it'll become obsolete, or it'll just fade away into general economics as sort of a small area. I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Sure. So, I wrote a paper 20 years ago that was called The Death of Behavioral Finance. And I predicted that it would die because finance would become as behavioral as it needs to be. And I think that is what's happening in economics. The big change, I've been at the University of Chicago for 26 years. And when I came here, I was an outlier. And now there are half a dozen people who call themselves behavioral economists, people like Devin Pope and Josh Dean and Alex Imus. But more important, there are lots of people who have behavioral economics as part of their toolkit. Just like there are people who run experiments or do econometrics or economic theory. So now, in terms of the replication crisis, it's interesting. I have another book project in a way that's similar to this one. I wrote a book before it was fashionable to write books called The Winner's Curse. And it was a collection of columns I had written in the Journal of Economic Perspectives that were titled Anomalies. And each one talks about a specific empirical fact that was inconsistent with standard economic theory. And those were written mostly in the late 80s. And the book went out of print. I wrote 6 more after the book was published. And the publisher said, maybe we should put this back into print. And I said, okay, well, let's add the other 6. And then I got the idea to get Alex Imus to join me in this project. And what we're doing is just publishing the old pieces and then adding a short statement about what's happened since. Mm-hmm. And you know what? there's not a single one where we have to change a word.
Interesting.
Everything replicates.
Fantastic.
There is no replication crisis in behavioral economics.
Yeah.
Now, there is a big replication crisis in priming.
Mm-hmm.
And, there's one notorious case that has been making the rounds that is exactly an experiment about priming.
Right.
And that's not a replication crisis. That's a problem of fraud. But the basic principles of behavioral economics, that people have self-control problems, that people care about fairness, that they loss aversion, I know this because every time I teach managerial decision making, I start by doing a survey of the students on all the classics, and there's almost no reason to collect the data.
Yeah, it's always the same.
It's always the same, always 90% of the students think that they will be above the median, and always the most popular decile is the second one because of modesty.
It's interesting, though, that even if we talk about replication crises in related disciplines, priming, social psychology more generally, we don't need to make a distinction between the so-called replication crisis in theory versus in practice. And you could take the extreme, position on the other side, which is taking off from your misbehaving book, seemingly irrelevant factors, SIFs. Is in the field, there are always SIFs that we don't see. And so the point you made there, and sort of that's implicit in the book here, is the need to test every single time. Didn't Ronald Reagan say trust but verify? I guess that's the message.
Well, so here's a good distinction. Loss aversion for sure exists. Mm-hmm. Now, does loss framing always have a significant effect?
Right.
No.
Right.
And if we go and replicate the Muggs experiment, it will always work.
Right.
Always.
Right.
But somebody who tries to describe something either as a loss or a foregone gain, that's somewhere between loss aversion and priming.
Correct.
And its power is somewhere in between. Similarly, on loss aversion, there's a big dispute about exactly what it is.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a psychology question.
Right.
To me, the fact that people are willing to pay, people who demand twice as much to give up a mug as they're willing to pay to get one. Mm-hmm. That's my fact.
Yep.
Why they do it, I let the psychologists argue about that.
Gotcha. One quick question from a lot of students, and then I'm going to move to Vera Rita, who has a question about what happens in organizations. But I teach this open online course, so we have lots of students from all across the global south, and I got a number of questions from people in Brazil and Africa and Asia that basically read your book and kind of say, well, I don't relate to this stuff because the examples are very different from where I live in. And I guess the more general question is, in your experience, do you see people we make a lot of these cross-cultural differences. Do you see people as more similar or more different? And in general, let me just read out the question. What advice would you have for those of us who are not in the westernized world on implementing some of the ideas from your book?
So, there is a large literature on cross-cultural differences, and I don't want to minimize them. But if you ask the question the way you did, which I think is a good way to ask it, do I view people as more similar or different? I'm definitely in the similar category. And so, for example, there was a series of experiments running the ultimatum game in various different countries. And yes, amusingly, Israelis play the game closest to the way a game theorist would, which I attribute to the fact that most Israelis are game theorists. But on the other hand, if you offer 10% of the pie anywhere in the world, you have a very good chance of getting turned down.
Right.
So maybe you have to offer 30% in this country and 10% in another, but nobody likes to be treated unfairly.
Okay.
Now, there are customs. So what people think of as fair, that's going to matter a lot. And even the role of markets and perceptions of fairness there. But, you know, the old fairness study that Danny and Jack Knetch and I did has been replicated all around the world. And you know, I'm guessing the R square across countries would be about 0.7 or 8.
Right. So that's essentially calibration of the phenomena. The strength of the phenomena might be different, but some of these basic things, fairness, loss aversion, mental accounting, are pretty common all across the world.
A topic near and dear to our hearts.
This is true. There's a question on mental accounting coming up.
Oh,
but before
good.
that,
let's get to that.
Vera Rita has a question about nudging for good and implementing that within organizations, all the way from Brazil, mind you.
Great.
Yeah. And well, thank you, Dilip. And
very good book I see behind you.
Don't you? Yeah, I have them all. And the first edition of Nudge, I have your signature there, Nudge for Good.
Okay,
when you came
good.
to Brazil in 2008.
Yes, I remember.
I was there. Good. Well, my question, please. Sometimes when organizations are trying to implement choice architecture to nudge for good, there might be some internal conflicts. For instance, a financial institution that is trying to design tools to help clients avoid credit that's not beneficial to them, and of course, the high interest that comes with it. And at the same time, another department in the same institution is trying to push credit because all they're looking at is profit. Any advice on how to deal with that using nudges and choice architecture?
Well, you know, I think this raises a big question. And I actually spent an hour with the board of a large Australian bank, Commonwealth Bank, that I think has recently become a partner with Rotman. They are trying to be what I call the good bank. Now, I write about this a little bit in the final edition. There is an open question as to whether a good bank can compete successfully against an evil bank. And the reason why it's a question is that the good bank might look more expensive. So if the evil bank says, here's a free credit card and a free checking account, and then there's a lot of sneaky fees, you know, it's like Ryan Airlines, that it looks cheap, but if you have a suitcase, good luck. So what I told CommBank is the only way to succeed as the good bank is via trust. So you have to be selling trust and you have to earn it. There's an old story. I will try and tell it quickly, but it's a good one. My wife, France, and I were in Thailand, and got in a cab. When you have to negotiate the fare, I negotiated really hard and got a fare of $3 or something for a 20-minute ride. And the driver said, "Would you like me to take you back?" And I said, "Sure, what would the fare be?" Continuing my tough negotiating. And I said, "Same fare." And now we have a dilemma of, will he come back and get me? And will I be there if he does? And he proposed a contract to solve this that no economist would ever suggest, which is, he said, "Don't pay me anything." Isn't that good?
Amazing.
It's really good.
Oh,
So when we got done with dinner, of course, we went to look for him. And then we said, "Oh, on the way back, we want to stop at this night market." He said, "Fine, I'll wait for you." Again, "Don't pay me anything." And when we were done there, we walked 15, 20 minutes out of our way to go find him because we now owed him $9.
Right.
So, I'm not saying that Air Canada can do this with a nonstop flight to Bangkok, but I think there is a deep lesson there that if you want to be the good X, the only way you can succeed is by being the place that people trust.
That's fantastic. Mental accounting. Matthew, you had a question on mental accounting.
I did. Thanks for having me, Dilip, and for being here, Richard. So this is a question that arose out of some confusion I had while reading about mental accounting in the book. I hope that I don't come across as too wet behind the ears in asking this question. But on the one hand, as I understood it, we learned that people are more likely to splurge impulsively on luxury purchases when they receive an unexpected windfall. But at the same time, or on the other hand, you seem to advocate for policy that withholds more money from the taxpayer to ensure larger tax refunds at the end of the year, as I understand, because the refund feels like a windfall and will lead to increased savings. I see those as somewhat contradictory. So how do I reconcile them?
So the bigger the windfall, the larger proportion will be saved, though some of it will get spent possibly on luxuries, possibly on durables. You can see this among academics, at least in the US, where there's this odd tradition of so-called summer money, that you get a 9-month contract, and then if you get a grant, or in some places it's just part of the deal, if you're continuing to do research, you get 2 months pay in the summer. Well, people live on their 9-month salary because they have to pay the rent every month, and then they get this lump. And you see both splurging and durable investments. And a study that I think would be very interesting to do is to compare people who get paid once a month with people who get paid every 2 weeks. And the reason is, if you get paid every 2 weeks, there are 2 months out of the year that you get 3 checks. And those will feel like little windfalls.
Mm-hmm.
And, if you're affluent enough, it won't matter. But if you're constantly checking whether you have enough money to buy shoes for the kids, then I'm guessing that behavior would be different in those two things, although it's a SIF. It's a supposedly irrelevant factor.
Fair enough. We're approaching the hour. We have about 12 minutes, so I'm going to try and get in a couple more questions from our guests. Brendan Calder is on the faculty at Rotman, was on the faculty. I guess Brendan is on his way to retirement, and he used to teach a class called Getting It Done, which was the most popular class at, I guess still is the most popular class at.
Can I take it?
You can.
Yeah.
Brendan, you had a question on getting nudging done.
We have guest students, Richard, but only if you are prepared to be exactly like a student in there.
Yeah, okay.
Anyway, it's great being in a Rotman room with you again, no matter even with the I was in a couple times before. I sent a question into Dilip, and it was knowing Dilip for the last 15 years or so or more. He taught me everything I know about all this stuff. It was a short clip, and he said, okay, we're going to ask you to do the question. I said, look, make it so it makes sense, okay? And so I'm going to read it, okay? He did make my comment, my question make sense to me as well as I hope to you. Here it goes. It is, Richard, you have said both in the book and elsewhere that nudges are usually not enough for solving complex problems, and that mandates and stronger shoves are sometimes necessary. This calls for a judicious mix of nudge and shove strategies, which might not be easy for a practitioner to perfect. What advice can you offer from a behavioral perspective on how the practitioner can choose between nudging and stronger options? There it is.
So, when we wrote the book originally, the idea was to show that there are some things we can accomplish even if we tie one hand behind our back and don't force anybody to do anything or even bribe them to do it. And that was like changing defaults and little nudges. And now, when it comes to climate change, we're not going to get there with nudges. And like every economist in the world, I'm in favor of a carbon tax or cap and trade, because we're not going to reduce emissions as long as they're free. And so our chapter on climate change starts with that. First, get the prices right. Now, there are nudges that can help, and you get effect sizes like 2 or 3%, which sounds small and are not going to do it if we look around the world, although they're nothing to sneeze at. And we quote our former colleague and former president, Barack Obama, who liked to say around the White House, better is good. So, and I've written recently about COVID. The first, I think there have been 3 phases of the vaccination process, at least in the US and in other places around the world. The first phase, it was, how can I get it? Mm-hmm. The second phase was getting to the undecideds or procrastinators and people for whom it was inconvenient. Now we're down to the last third, and a lot of them have quite strong opinions. And so in my view, they should get some shoves. So I don't know what Toronto is doing, but University of Chicago, if you want to show up here next week, as a student, you have to be vaccinated. And as a faculty member, you have to be vaccinated. And I'm supposed to start teaching in 2 weeks. I'm glad that rule is in place. And I'm not sure at my age that I would be that happy to be doing it otherwise. So yes, that would be taking some freedoms away from some people, but it's just like we did with smoking. It used to be when we were kids that you could smoke almost anywhere. And then you stopped being able to smoke in your office and in a restaurant and on an airplane. And I think we all now think that was quite sensible and maybe a bit slow in coming. Mm-hmm. And so I think it would be perfectly reasonable to say, if you want to go to a hockey game you have to show us your vaccination card. Of course, that has to come after you've had the opportunity to give everyone who wants a vaccine the opportunity to get one.
One of the things that happened, Richard, over the last 12 years was the Sveriges Riksbank Prize. That. And I see you've quoted your fellow Nobel Prize winner, Bob Dylan, a few times in the book as well.
We're both fans of his.
I can see that. Nico Lasotera, my colleague, has a question about not so much the prize itself, but the fact that it has now given you more hats to wear than you even had before. So Nico, do you want to jump in and ask that question? You're on mute, Nick.
Okay, sorry about that. I should have learned by now. So, yeah, I mean, some time ago, I don't remember if it was before or after the prize, you were answering a question that the fellow academic economist asked on Twitter. She said, what would you give as an advice to a graduate student? And people gave a bunch of answers. I think my answer was call your mom more often or something like that. But what you said is, make your research about the world, not about the literature. And that stuck with me a lot. And in a sense, this is a challenge that we all go through when it looks as though you were very successful in being, of course, like at the top of the academic profession, but also in being able to convey your research and concepts from behavioral science and economics to the broader population with quite an impact. And my question is, I mean, how challenging is that, and how perhaps even risky is it for an academic to do this? We see many academics, we see it, during the pandemic, being more confusing than helpful when talking on TV or writing an article and so on.
So let me clarify what I meant by that. And I've been saying that for decades. So it's not a post-Nobel thing.
I can attest to that.
Yeah, I probably gave Dilip this advice 26 years ago. What I mean by that is looking out the window rather than reading journal articles.
Yes.
I don't mean everybody should be trying to advise governments.
Sure.
There are a lot of people that the world would be better off if they were not advising governments. And it's, lots of people, that's just not what they do. But I do think that there's a trap that people start reading papers and they end up writing the 25th paper on some topic because there's some gap that no one has filled. And, I've rarely written more than 2 papers on any topic because I have a short attention span. And I'd rather write the first paper on mental accounting than the 100th. And so people were doing mental accounting before I gave it a name, just like they were nudging before we gave it a name. And, one of my favorite young economists is a guy at Harvard called Sheng-Wu Li, who's a theorist, but his papers are very much about the world.
Oh.
And, I think he's a model. Unfortunately, we're not all as smart as him, but he's a model that you can be a theorist and very much be about the world.
Fantastic. We are almost out of time. So I have a lot of other questions I could have asked, but 6 o'clock, I guess we run by the clock. So that's where we are. Before we say thanks, just a couple of quick announcements. Next Wednesday, we are hosting Cornell professor Vanessa Bones, and she's going to talk about her book, You Have More Influence Than You Think. And then on October the 4th, Steven Pinker on rationality. And those are just the next two events, and then there'll be more on our website. Richard, it's been an honor and pleasure to have you as always. We do hope that once we solve all of the final 1/3 problem with vaccinations, that we will get you back here in person into a crowded Desautels Hall at the Rotman School. But on behalf of everybody who's tuned in, everybody that had questions, and all of my colleagues at the Rotman School, thank you so very much.
Thank you, Dilip, and thanks to all my friends in Canada and around the world, and nudge for good.
We'll do that.
Thank you.